Welcome to today's deep dive.
Mhm.
We're jumping right into a subject that might honestly sound at first glance like the last thing you'd ever want to revisit.
I can only imagine what people are thinking right now.
Right, I mean a standardized test syllabus. But seriously, stick with me here. Today we are opening up the Unified AP History Examination Framework and Assessment Guide.
It's quite the title.
It is. And, I remember my own high school history tests. If I could just remember that the War of 1812 started in, spoiler alert, 1812.
A classic.
Yeah, and maybe name a general or two, I was pretty much golden. But as we dig into this document today, it becomes incredibly clear that this is an entirely different beast.
It really is. And the phrase you just used about memorizing a date and a general,
Yeah.
that perfectly highlights what this framework is actively trying to destroy.
Destroy. Okay, strong word. I
Yeah.
like it.
Well, it's true. The test makers have designed this single guide to be the identical blueprint for three massive high school subjects. You've got AP European History, AP US History, which, by the way, the document cheerfully notes is pronounced APUSH.
APUSH. I love that they actually put the pronunciation in the official framework.
Great. And then the third one is AP World History, modern. But we need to frame this correctly right out of the gate for you listening. This is not a test of memory.
No, not at all.
It is a highly engineered psychological gauntlet.
A psychological gauntlet. Okay, I love that description. And that is exactly why this deep dive is for you today.
Absolutely.
Whether you're a lifelong learner, maybe you're helping someone prep for this exam, or you're just a curious person wanting to know how we define historical literacy today.
Which is a very relevant topic.
Exactly. This deep dive is basically a shortcut to understanding the mechanics of what is essentially a 3-hour and 15-minute intellectual marathon.
The marathon metaphor is really crucial here because the exam is divided into these very distinct sections, and they essentially force the student's brain to run totally different types of races.
Like switching from a sprint to a hurdle mid-race.
Exactly like that. It uses highly specific question types, really strict weightings, precise time limits. The structure itself dictates how a student must process information,
And it changes the rules on them just as they get comfortable.
always keeping them off balance.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to start with the very first hurdle. We can think of Section 1 as the sprint.
A very fast sprint.
Yeah, this is Section 9, Part A of the exam, and it is entirely multiple choice questions.
But not the kind you're probably picturing.
Right, so you are staring down 55 questions, and you have exactly 55 minutes to answer them.
1 minute per question.
1 minute, and this section alone makes up a massive 40% of the total exam weight.
What's fascinating here is how the test designers prevent students from hiding behind rote memorization. They use what the guide calls stimulus-based questions. Stimulus-based.
Yes, so
Oh.
they aren't just asking a standalone trivia question like, what year did the French Revolution start?
Right, so you can't just guess, C, hope you remembered a flashcard from the night before, and move on.
You really can't.
But what exactly does stimulus-based mean in this context? Let's break that down for someone who hasn't, sat in a classroom in a decade or two.
Sure. A stimulus is basically a piece of historical evidence, and the questions come in sets of 3 or 4, and every single set is anchored to something you have to analyze right there on the spot.
So they have to read something first.
Read or look at. It could be any primary text, meaning a document written during the actual time period, or a secondary text, like a modern historian arguing a point.
Okay, so text heavy.
Yes, but it also includes visual stimuli. The guide specifically lists artwork, photos, posters, cartoons, charts, quantitative data, and maps.
Wow. Okay, so imagine handing a 16-year-old a political cartoon from the French Revolution.
Right.
Maybe it shows the peasant class carrying the clergy and nobility on their backs. A classic image from that era.
Right. They have to look at that, figure out the bias, understand the historical context, and then answer 3 distinct questions about how it relates to broader societal shifts.
All in about 3 minutes?
3 minutes total to do all of that. That is wild.
It is. And the guide guarantees they will also have to navigate at least one set of paired text-based stimuli.
Paired texts.
Yeah. This means reading 2 different texts side by side, perhaps 2 politicians arguing opposite sides of a tariff debate,
Oh, wow.
and then they have to synthesize or compare them while that clock is just ticking down.
And the scope of this is what really gets me when looking at the framework. This multiple choice sprint can pull from the entire chronological framework of the courses.
The whole thing.
Think about the timelines you have to hold in your head. If you're taking AP Euro, it's roughly 1450 to the present.
Over 500 years.
For APUSH, it's 1491 to the present. And for AP World History, you are responsible for everything from the year 1200 to today.
8 centuries of human history.
So you could be analyzing that French Revolution cartoon, and literally the very next question set is a data chart about 20th century global trade.
It demands an exceptional level of cognitive flexibility. The student's brain is constantly shifting gears, jumping across centuries and continents.
It sounds like it's designed to give you intellectual whiplash.
That's essentially the goal. The educational theory here is that true historical comprehension means being able to apply critical thinking skills instantly, regardless of the era.
Okay, so they survive this 55-minute sprint. Their brains are absolutely buzzing.
Right.
And then the exam forces them to completely change tactics.
A hard left turn.
Yeah. This brings us to Section 2, the pivot. We are now in Section I, Part B, the short answer questions.
The SAQs.
Right. Students face 3 short written responses in 40 minutes, and this makes up 20% of the exam.
This shift is significant. Going from selecting an answer from a pre-written list to generating your own written response requires a completely different retrieval process in the brain.
Because you aren't recognizing anymore.
Exactly. You are producing.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because the framework doesn't just say, hey, write 3 short answers. It imposes this very strict structure, introducing the concept of forced choices.
The forced choices are brilliant.
They really are. So question 1 is required, and it always includes a secondary source stimulus. Question 2 is also required, but it flips the script by using a primary source stimulus.
Let's pause there for a second.
Yep, please. What is the functional difference for the student between tackling a secondary source versus a primary source?
It's a great question. Let's use a really straightforward example. A primary source is raw history. Think of a diary entry from a Civil War soldier complaining about the lack of rations.
Okay, right from the source.
Right. A secondary source is digested history. It's a textbook written by a historian a century later analyzing how supply chain failures impacted the overall war effort.
I see.
So the first required question asks the student to interact with the historian's argument. The second required question asks them to analyze the raw, unfiltered evidence from the ground. It tests 2 very different analytical muscles.
That makes a lot of sense. So they get through those 2 required stimulus-backed questions. But for the third question, the safety net completely vanishes.
Completely.
The student gets a choice between question 3 or question 4, and neither of these final options includes a stimulus.
Nothing to look at.
Nothing. They are flying completely blind on their own historical recall.
This is where we need to look really closely at how the exam divides up the course timelines, because the test designers didn't do this randomly.
Right, there's a method to the madness.
If you look at the required questions, the ones with the stimuli we just talked about, they almost universally focus on the middle to modern eras of the respective courses.
Okay, let's look at the dates. For AP Euro, questions 1 and 2 cover 1600 to 2001. For APUSH, it's 1754 to 1980.
And for AP World, it's 1200 to 2001.
Right, so rather than listing out every single date, it's structured so the mandatory stuff hits the core middle chunks of the history.
Exactly. But what about that final choice they have to make?
Yeah, the choice between 3 and 4.
That final choice allows students to actually play to their strengths. The guide dictates that question 3 will always cover the earliest eras of the course.
So for AP Euro, that's 1450 to 1815.
Think the Renaissance or early global exploration. And question 4 will always cover the later modern eras.
Which for Euro is 1815 to 2001.
Like the Industrial Revolution through the Cold War.
And it's similar for the others. APUSH, question 3 is 1491 to 1877, while question 4 is 1865 to 2001.
And AP World lets you choose between 1200 to 1750 or 1750 to 2001.
So it actually gives the student a tiny bit of agency in an otherwise completely rigid environment.
It does.
If you know you struggle with 15th century trade routes, but you are an absolute expert on the Cold War, you can just choose question 4 and lean into what you know.
Precisely. It acknowledges that human memory isn't perfect, and it tests whether a student knows their own intellectual strengths well enough to make a strategic decision under pressure.
But they can't get too comfortable with that little bit of agency. Because once those 40 minutes are up, we enter Section 3.
The big one.
The big one. I call this one the heavyweight champion. We are talking about Section 2, Question 1, the document-based question.
Famously known as the DBQ.
The DBQ. It is just one single essay. but students are given 60 minutes to conquer it, which includes a crucial 15-minute reading period, and it is worth a massive 25% of the entire exam.
The DBQ is truly the centerpiece of the AP history experience. It is the ultimate test of all the skills we've been discussing so far.
And it sounds brutally intense. The framework dictates that students are handed 7 different documents. 7.
It's a lot to process.
Offering various perspectives on a single, specific historical development. Now, realistically, how on earth do they outline and write a cohesive essay analyzing 7 documents in 45 minutes of writing time?
It's a daunting task.
Was that even possible without just regurgitating what the papers say?
Well, if they just regurgitate what the papers say, they fail the section.
Oh, just straight up fail.
The rubric is incredibly unforgiving on this point. It's like being handed 7 puzzle pieces from 3 different puzzles, and you have to prove to the grader which pieces actually belong together to form a coherent picture.
So what are the actual steps they have to hit to get a good score? Walk us through this gauntlet.
First, they must respond to the prompt with a historically defensible thesis or claim.
Okay.
That means you can't just say, the Industrial Revolution had many effects. That's a summary.
Right, it's too vague.
A defensible thesis is taking a specific stand that you can prove using the evidence. For example, arguing that while it increased overall economic output, it primarily did so by systematically exploiting unskilled labor.
Okay, so they have to plant a flag and take a firm position. What's next?
Next, they have to describe the broader historical context. They have to zoom out.
Zoom out how?
They can't act like the event happened in a vacuum. They have to explain the geopolitical or social climate that allowed the event to happen in the first place.
Got it.
Then, they must support their argument using at least 4 of those 7 provided documents.
Then I imagine they can't just drop quotes randomly.
No, the guide requires them to use the documents to explicitly support their thesis. And here is where it gets even harder.
Harder than synthesizing 4 documents in under an hour.
Yes. They are required to bring in at least 1 piece of specific historical evidence that is entirely outside of the provided documents.
Wait, really?
Yes. They have to pull a relevant, specific fact from their own memory that strengthens their argument.
So you have the 7 documents sitting right in front of you, but you still have to dig into your own brain to find an 8th piece of evidence just to prove you actually know the subject.
Exactly, to demonstrate what the rubric calls complex understanding.
That is wild. And there's another requirement here regarding bias, isn't there? When I was reading the framework, this felt like the most vital part of the whole thing.
Yes, the sourcing requirement. For at least 2 of the documents, the student must explain how or why the document's point of view, its purpose, its historical situation, or its audience is relevant to the argument.
You can't just accept a document at face value.
Never.
So if one of the documents is a letter from a factory owner praising the working conditions, the student has to explicitly write something like, "We must view this document with skepticism because the author's purpose is to avoid government regulation and his audience is a panel of lawmakers."
Exactly. They have to interrogate the source. And doing all of this, the thesis, the context, analyzing 4 documents, bringing in outside evidence, and interrogating the bias of at least 2 authors in under an hour, it is a monumental task.
Yeah. It's essentially acting as a genuine historian. A real historian doesn't just read a textbook. They go into an archive, find a messy, contradictory pile of letters and data, and try to find the truth while acknowledging that everyone writing those letters had an agenda.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you start to see why this is basically a training ground for modern media literacy.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll touch on that more later, but the skills required here are exactly what it takes to navigate the modern information landscape.
Before we move on from the DBQ, there's a quirky detail in the framework about the time periods it covers.
Ah, yes. The DBQ timeline?
Right. The DBQ actually skips the earliest eras of the courses. AP Euro only tests from 1600 onward. AP USH starts at 1754. And AP World skips its first 250 years and starts at 1450.
It's a very specific choice.
Why do you think the test designers give them a slight reprieve from those early eras here?
It likely comes down to the availability and the complexity of primary sources. To ask a student to synthesize 7 diverse documents, you need an era that produced a wealth of varied written and visual material.
Right.
The later eras, especially post-printing press and into the modern age, just offer a much richer tapestry of conflicting sources for the test makers to draw from to build a good DBQ.
That makes perfect sense. All right, we are nearing the end of the marathon. The student has sprinted through the multiple choice. They've pivoted through the short answers, and they've wrestled the DBQ heavyweight. Now, they hit section 4,
The final stretch.
the final stretch. This is the long essay question, or the LEQ.
Yeah.
It is one essay chosen from 3 different prompts, completed in 40 minutes, and it's worth the final 15% of the exam.
This raises an important question about cognitive endurance. Let's really talk about the physical and mental reality of a teenager sitting in that chair at hour 3.
They have to be exhausted.
Their brain is depleted, and yet this section offers absolutely no safety net.
Right, the guide states clearly, no document stimuli provided.
Nothing.
Nothing to read, nothing to spark a memory. They look at a one-sentence prompt, and they have to generate an entire, highly structured essay from scratch. This sounds brutal.
And the rubric remains incredibly demanding. Once again, they need a historically defensible thesis and broader historical context.
Okay, same as the DBQ.
But because there are no documents, they must support their argument using at least 2 pieces of specific, relevant evidence entirely from their own knowledge.
Double the outside evidence of the DBQ.
And they still have to demonstrate complex understanding. But the key requirement here is that they must use historical reasoning.
Let's translate that for everyone. What does the guide actually mean by historical reasoning?
The guide specifically dictates that students must frame their essay around one of 3 concepts: comparison, causation, or continuity and change over time.
Okay, so they aren't just listing facts chronologically.
Not at all. If the prompt is about causation, they have to explain why an event happened and rank the causes by importance. If it's continuity and change, they have to explain what stayed the same during a time period and what drastically altered.
It requires a really high-level structural understanding of how history flows.
Exactly.
Now, to help them out just a tiny bit, the test designers do use that same strategic era-splitting trick we saw in the short answers.
Right, the 3 prompts.
The 3 prompts they get to choose from perfectly slice up the course into early, middle, and late periods. So for AP Euro, option 1 is 1450 to 1700, option 2 is 1648 to 1914, and option 3 is 1815 to 2001.
And APUSH slices it up as 1491 to 1800, then 1800 to 1898, and finally 1890 to 2001.
And AP World is 1200 to 1750, 1450 to 1900, and 1750 to 2001.
Yes.
So right as their brain is failing them, they at least get to choose which century they want to dig into.
It is a small mercy. But it still requires them to pull highly specific facts out of thin air and apply a complex structural reasoning model after nearly 3 hours of intense analysis.
So what does this all mean when we step back from the strict rubrics, the specific document counts, the ticking clocks? We are looking at a staggering architecture here.
It really is an architectural feat.
The test makers are demanding a careful, holistic balance. You have the rapid-fire critical thinking in the multiple-choice sprint.
Right.
You have the shift to generated recall in the short answers. You have the intense, high-stakes source synthesis of the DBQ.
Yeah.
And you finish with the pure recall and structured historical reasoning of the long essay.
It is designed so that a student cannot succeed by merely being good at one type of task.
You have to be well-rounded.
They must be adaptable. If you only know facts but you cannot argue them, you fail.
Right?
If you can argue beautifully but you don't know any actual facts to back it up, you fail. And most importantly, if you trust everything you read without questioning the author's motive, you fail.
And that is exactly why this matters to you, listening to us right now.
100%.
Even if you are decades removed from a high school classroom and you never plan to take an AP exam in your life, this framework is a profound tool.
It goes way beyond history.
When you realize that we are actively training students to identify bias, to demand specific evidence, and to seek broader context before forming an opinion, you see that this isn't just a history syllabus. It is the ultimate cheat sheet for being an informed citizen today.
I think that is the most vital takeaway from this entire document. The skills of a competent historian are the exact same skills required to be a media-literate adult.
Absolutely.
And I would like to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building directly on that idea.
Let's hear it.
Consider how this precise AP history framework could be applied to your daily media consumption. Imagine if you treated your social media feed or the daily news broadcast exactly like a document-based question.
Oh, I love where this is going.
Think about it. What if, before you reacted to a story or shared a post, you stopped and identified the varying perspectives?
Like looking at the 7 document.
Exactly. What if you actively acknowledged the biases present, questioned the historical situation and the true purpose of the author, and required yourself to find outside specific evidence before you formed your own internal thesis.
That would change everything.
If you approached your daily information intake with the exact same rigorous gauntlet demanded of these high school students, how drastically would your understanding of current events change?
Treat your news feed like a DBQ. It would certainly slow down the endless scrolling, but the depth of your understanding would be incredible. Well, that wraps up our journey through the AP History Examination Framework. We hope you enjoyed exploring the mechanics of this mental marathon with us. Keep questioning your sources, keep seeking that broader context, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.